How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
President of El Salvador and the President of the United States are playing hot potato with the rights of a human being simply because their egos are too big to admit that there's, gray areas, right? That due processes are thin and mistakes can be made, okay? So coming off of the Supreme Court saying, hey, the gentleman from Maryland, okay, that was deported should be returned since it was an administrative error, right? The President of the United States and his administration said, no, we can't do that because we're not going to infringe on the sovereign rights of another country, right? So they're starting this Ponzi scheme, okay? So now Bukele comes to the United States and says he can't do that. He can't smuggle a terrorist back into the United States. And this is what, they both have authoritarian traits, okay? To a certain extent, because we're in a much more modern world, they kind of have to do some type of like shadowy way, like they have to go about it in a shadowy way. But they're going to prey on the fact that there's a lot of people in both countries that have been fearmongered, that have been convinced that, this threat. Okay, now El Salvador much worse than the United States. I'm not gonna sugarcoat that. But this threat, right, is much more important than the infringement of your rights. Okay, and the biggest thing that most people should mind about what's going on here with these two guys is that slowly but surely, how they process this gentleman, all right, Mr. Garcia, is going to set a precedent on how they will treat United States citizens. Because in this same interview, if you watch more clips, they talked about that, all right? He has referenced, I'm not sure if it's legal, but I would love to send criminals or U.S. citizens over there as well, right? But anyway, let's go back to Mr. Garcia and just kind of really get it together. So now he's saying he can't send him back to the United States because the court said, hey, you made an administrative error. You sent them to El Salvador, and that what is it, a CECOT, CECOT? I don't know how you want to pronounce it, which is one of the worst prisons in the world. If you made a mistake, at bare minimum, I would think you, Bukele, would admit, okay, he made a mistake, but he was originally a citizen of El Salvador, so maybe he can go about his life in El Salvador, even though that's not really his life anymore. He's married to a U.S. citizen. But to admit all of this, right, would have to you would be showing the U.S. population and El Salvador population as a chinking armor, that some of you lots are idiots, some of you lots are moving like authoritarians, some of you lots, quite frankly, don't have your T's crossed and your I's dotted, right? That's what this would. But instead of taking that small L, right, and being able to admit to both your countries that mistakes can happen, they'll rather just keep the facade going. You understand what I'm saying? Because at the end of the day, he knows, right? He knows. He's the president. He knows the circumstances around that gentleman that was deported. And he knows the circumstances around the gentleman that was deported. But they're banking on the fact that their supporters, like his supporters, are the migrants. They are like the immigrants, and you know what I mean. And they painted the migrants as terrorists, right? So he knows that, and he's saying that's why I'm sending them to El Salvador. Citizens of El Salvador are not, like the Venezuelans won't take them, right? Whatever. But he knows that the citizens of El Salvador were terribly in a terrible situation with gangs in his country. So even after getting it under control, they don't want to have any wiggle room, right? They don't want to have any wiggle room to show any chinks in the armor because it takes away from their authoritarian stance, right? And it's really unfortunate. If you watch more of these clips, it's a waste of time to a certain extent. But when you start seeing Stephen Miller lying that the Supreme Court decision was in their favor, little things like that. At this point, I'm past like, oh, if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent. This is like all of Americans should have a problem with this, right? And maybe that's what makes us different from El Salvador, right? Is that I would like to think that Americans as a whole can say, hey, you got this wrong, dog. We ain't like these other countries. Let's get it together. You know what I'm saying?